The Federation of Governing Bodies of South African Schools has questioned the Gauteng Provincial Education Department's authority to suspend food sales outright. This comes after the Gauteng government's instructions to suspend the sale of food in and around schools due to the rising food poisoning crisis. According to the Gauteng government, new bylaws will be introduced to govern how spaza shops and vendors should operate. Let's now bring in the CEO for the Federation of Governing Bodies of the South African Schools for more on this story, Jaco Deacon. Jaco, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. So what was your first impression when you heard about this circular and that the Education Department has sent to the various schools?
Good morning, Alvin. I was actually very concerned because our Constitutional Court ruled a few years ago on a principle of legality. And the Constitutional Court then said, it seems central to the conception of our constitutional order that the legislature and executive in every sphere are constrained by the principle that they may exercise no power and perform no function beyond that conferred upon them by law. And that's our concern, not the fact that we try to address a crisis, but how we do things. So if you don't have the legal authority to issue such an instruction, it cannot be done. Then it falls outside the ambit of the competency of the Department of Education. So we would have expected the Department of Health to enforce the health regulations or the municipalities to enforce the bylaws because that's their sphere of competency in terms of the legislation.
Yeah, so what would the limitations be in terms of the authority of the Department of Education in Gauteng? Because we know that education is a provincial competency. When it comes to their infrastructure, their schools, so would they be? Do they have the authority to say within the schools, within the schoolyards, we are suspending the sale of food, and not go as far as saying that in and around the school? So where does the limitation lie?
Yeah, no, they don't even have the authority within the schools ground, as we don't have state schools. We've got public schools, and all our public schools are separate legal entities. So one legal entity cannot simply instruct another to do a few things just because they wish to do so. So we don't have a state school system where the state have the authority. But we're in a partnership model. So the department can and should engage with the SGBs, the school governing bodies, to ask them, please assist. We're concerned about 1, 2, 3. Can you help to do the following? And not to bark out instructions like we've seen. You cannot rule by decree through circulars and newsletters. We've abandoned that style of doing things more than 30 years ago. So that's why we're concerned. Talk to your schools as partners. It's public schools, not state schools. Respect those boundaries as well.
Yeah. And then speak to us about the authority of the SGBs in such a case. What would be required of the SGBs? Would it be the state or the government in this case saying that this is what we are proposing? SGBs must sit down and decide whether or not they want to go ahead with that proposal.
Well, if you look at school safety on grassroots level, that's the responsibility of the governing body. So every governor should be very concerned about what's happening in and around the school. So part of the risk management of your governing body and your school management team would be to assess your tuck shop and assess food sales, make sure that you comply with the regulations, and that's good governance. So you'll start there first. Then you can report to the department to say we're satisfied that we've complied, and let's help and assist you to distribute information in the community. And that's the partnership model. But the party responsible on school level would be your governing body and your school management team.
Yeah. How do we deal with this? Yesterday, for instance, I was speaking to the Premier of Gauteng on the show about this particular decision. It seems as though that he didn't have much information around this as well. But what he had said is that when this proposal came to his table, he advised the people to speak to the various stakeholders that there must be consultation. And also taking into consideration that consultation may take some time, a unilateral decision was then taken to implement this particular ban. And his argument around that is because of the safety concern, that it is an emergency and there needs to be a level of urgency in how the state responds to this. What's your reaction to that? Because it does speak that at the end of the day, it is about the lives of these children as well.
Absolutely, but even in a crisis, we cannot ignore the Constitution and we cannot ignore the principles of legality. It's one of the cornerstones of our constitutional democracy. And the moment we abandon that, we're in serious trouble. So the very same Constitution makes provision to deal with a crisis. And that's what we expect our leaders to do, is to use the legal instruments to the best of their ability. You cannot abuse your power to say it's in the interest of children. Under the Constitution, you still need to follow the process and the rules. I'm concerned about the absence of the Department of Health. Surely the Department of Education and the Premier should have consulted with the Department of Health. It's within their power to bring emergency measures to the fore and to apply those emergency measures. It's within the ambit of local government, municipalities, to enforce the bylaws. So the mechanisms are there. It's to use the right one and not to abuse power and act outside the scope of what's expected from the department and what's allowed in terms of that principle of legality.
Yeah, now that this decision has been taken, your argument that it is an unlawful decision and an unlawful instruction at that, would the schools be wrong if they were to decide to allow hawkers, vendors to continue selling food to children?
Well, on the school ground, outside the school ground, the school governing body don't have any authority. They only have authority within the ambit of the school ground. And you cannot create law through a circular. So that circular doesn't create any obligations and it's not binding upon the SGBs. They're bound by the municipal bylaws and the regulations on safe preparation of food and all those regulations, and they must comply with that. But there's no legal effect or power to a circular, so that won't make any difference at the school.
So as the Federation of Governing Bodies for South African Schools, what's your next step in this particular matter? Because on the other end as well, there is a livelihood conversation that needs to be had for these hawkers as well as the vendors.
Indeed, but that's a discussion between your local government and the Department of Health with the vendors. We can only focus on what we have control, and that's on the school ground, the type of vendors we allow, or the third-party suppliers we allow on the school ground, or where schools prepare food themselves or sell food themselves. Make sure that you comply. That's where governing bodies can take control and where they should take control. Obviously, I think they can play a vital role to distribute information in school communities, to communicate to the parents, to make learners aware. But again, that will be a partnership model. You're not simply going to instruct somebody to do 1, 2, or 3 if you don't have the authority. We're also concerned about it. It's our children, but let's do it in a right and appropriate way, in line with our constitutional values and the principles of our constitutional democracy.
So for now, as it stands, there's no intention of taking any legal action against the department?
No, it's not that the circular, they cannot enforce the circular because it's not law. So the schools aren't bound by that circular.
Yeah, just in closing, Jaco, what would your proposal be as a body that works with school governing bodies as well, to say that how do we respond to these particular crises that are unfolding in our schools? And this is not limited to Gauteng. We've seen it happening in other provinces as well. I think the province of the Free State has also made a similar a call to various schools as well to stop the sales of food in and around schools. So,
yes,
what would your advice be?
Yeah, Alden, we've seen that in Limpopo, we've seen it in the Free State, KZN. So my advice is threefold. Number one, SGB, make sure that when you sell food, when you allow people to do it on the school ground, make sure it's safe, it's in line with the regulations, and enforce it on school ground, number one. Number two, school is a vital component of community. So to distribute information, to make information available to the parents, to communicate to the learners, to be vigilant, help the learners to identify what are those potential pitfalls. And number three is to put pressure on the local authorities to enforce the bylaws. And from FEDSAS side, we'll put pressure on the Department of Education to actively engage with the Department of Health, with local law enforcement, with the municipalities, because it's their duty to protect society, not only the learners in the schools, but to protect the whole society against that. And people are getting paid to do that. So we expect the department to comply and to assist schools to engage with their sister departments.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. Jaco Deacon is the CEO for the Federation of Governing Bodies of South African Schools. Truly appreciate your time.